Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for what is the fifth keynote, I think, in our series since we started the IIEA webinars in just after the start of COVID. And just to say, we just a couple of housekeeping things, and I'm going to hand over to Nadereh and Danny. So the first thing is we've actually extended the deadline for the 7th International Conference on Iran's Economy, which is happening in Doha, November 27th to 28th. So the submission deadline is now actually 10th of July. So it's exactly 1 month's time. And you can find a link to submit on our website. And the other thing, which is perhaps as you haven't noticed exciting, is that we also have just announced a prize of the best gender paper, which has a prize, actual prize in the amount of $500 for the best paper on the topics of gender and economic issues that is presented at or planned to be presented in the conference in Doha. So please do submit your papers by July 10th month's time. And the final housekeeping thing is, if you wanted to if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in, but not in the chat box, in the Q&A box of the webinar, as usual. So I hand over to you now, Nadereh.
Well, thank you very much, Kaufmann. I'm delighted to be here today and to host this webinar. My name is Nadereh Chamlou. I am currently a member of the board of the International Iranian Economic Association, and extremely proud to have this session, as well as to invite one of my very dear and longtime colleagues, who is a worldwide expert on this topic of corruption, to give us some insights into the analytics, the measurements, and possibly also the way to battle corruption. Now, first of all, corruption can mean a lot of things to different people. So one of the first things that we would like to ask our esteemed speaker is to really define corruption as is done in the analytical, in the analytical world as such. But in general, everybody from everywhere around the world complains about corruption being a very important impediment to effective development in all aspects. In fact, the United Nations has designated or has said that corruption is a major hurdle to the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. Despite the fact that many efforts have been done, such as, for instance, the Convention Against Corruption, which 190 countries have signed, including Iran, but still corruption persists, and corruption is in many ways a critical hurdle to development and to people's well-being. With that, I'm extremely delighted to introduce our speaker. Dr. Daniel Kaufmann is currently a non-resident fellow at Brookings Institute and has carried out for decades policy analysis, applied research on a variety of economic issues, in particular on governance, regulation, and corruption around the world. He is a renowned writer, lecturer, analyst on governance, corruption, and development, and with particular experience in Latin America, Europe, Middle East, and North Africa, as well as the African continent and the industrialized and transition economy. So every type of country, he has had some kind of, or at least a great deal of experience. He's also currently chief advisor at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, after having served as its president and CEO from 2013 to 2020, and is currently a member of the international board of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. He also serves in various other international advisory boards, such as the OECD Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Group on Anti-Corruption and Integrity, the Inter-American Development Bank President's High-Level Advisory Group on Transparency, and the Mo Ibrahim Foundation in Africa. Previously, and that's how I know Dr. Kaufmann, he served as the director for World Bank Institute, where he pioneered new approaches to measure, diagnose, and address governance and corruption, and help countries formulate action programs. Dr. Kaufmann has also been a member of the Global Agenda Council and a member of the faculty of the World Economic Forum, and has published in leading journals, so much so that in the research, policy, and media circles, his name is associated with innovations such as the Worldwide Governance Indicators, the Resource Governance Index, and with the analysis of legal corruption and state capture. So we are extremely delighted to have him. Dr. Kaufmann is a Chilean national who received his MA and PhD in economics from Harvard University. With that, and his CV goes on and on, so this is a very short version of his accomplishments. With that, I'm extremely delighted, and I want to thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us, as since corruption in the eyes of the Iranians and Iranian public is a major problem that has been around for decades, and it seems that it's getting worse and worse by the year. So with that, thank you so much, and please go ahead. Just a quick run of the program. Danny's presentation will be about 35 minutes, 40 minutes, followed by Q&A and clarification. So please do send us your questions, and we are very much looking forward to what he has to say. Thank you so much. Please, over to you.
Well, thanks, Nadereh. Thanks, everybody present. And this is a very special initiative, and your association, I know it's extremely well taken, and with great experts in economics and related fields. So with that in mind, I wanted to, before I go into the presentation, and I will have slides because it's going to be a lot, as you suggested, Nadereh, about metrics and what does the data show, letting the data speak a bit. But before getting to that, first, at the personal level, to suggest that I may be even more incoherent than usual because I literally just stepped into the hotel from a flight, and there were some issues. That's why I was at the last minute. I expected to have at least 1 hour. But the upside of that is that maybe that will make it a little bit less formal. And I look very much forward to the discussion after the presentation, which I hope is not just the one-directional Q&A and clarifications, but also commentary, because to be totally clear, my expertise is certainly not Iran. That's yours. All what I can say for now, when you mention Iran and corruption, is that you are not alone. And that's what we're going to see during the presentation. Of course, the presentation will also feature in a comparative setting what Iran's situation is according to the data at hand, which some of you may know, but there are some interesting insights that may come out from the comparative approach. And I will get also into the issues of definitions and so on, but the approach is going to be a bit broader than just focusing on corruption, because I've been accused for decades already of having coined the notion that one doesn't fight corruption by fighting corruption. And instead, one has to broaden the understanding of what are the fundamental drivers behind it, and that leads that we have no choice but looking at the systemic issues institutionally, social rules of the game, and governance, broadly speaking, which is going to be part and parcel of the presentation, but with data and analytics. So without further ado, let me now go into the and we can get started with it. So at first, in terms of just basically the topics and outline, why focus on governance to address corruption? I already gave a hint about that. It will come out again and again during the discussion. And then we'll get into definition and measurement issues worldwide, regionally, for some countries, for trends, and so forth. And we also touch not only on the measurement of corruption and related issue of governance, but what does the evidence suggest in terms of causes and consequences related to corruption. It's not going to be exhaustive because of the timing and because the presentation is rather broad, but we can go back during the discussion to those issues. And then we will touch upon a particular aspect of misgovernance that I've also been working on, also with partners, particularly one in the past, Joel Hellman, which is the notion and the challenge of state capture, which I believe to have become even more relevant nowadays, and it doesn't get sufficient attention. So we will go through that, including new metrics that I've been working on in terms of research. And then we'll get into the implications, the challenges ahead, the question and discussion, which I very much look forward to. So first, to get quickly into the issue of definition and metrics at the same time, because of what I said earlier, that one doesn't fight corruption by fighting corruption, and we will see that again. Let's talk a little bit about governance, which is like corruption and many other topics in the social sciences. It's a bit mushy sometimes, and it depends on who one is talking to or reading are different definitions. But with my partner in terms of the governance indicators, where we started the work more than a quarter century ago, in fact, in the mid-90s, Art Cray, we reviewed the literature, and this is a synthesis of the literature in terms of defining governance as a set of institutions and norms by which authority in a country is exercised. That's fun enough, but if one doesn't start to specifically unpack it, it may not be very useful to just say that. It's the rules of the game in a country. So specifically, we unpack it into three key clusters, which are the political cluster of governance, the economic cluster of governance, and the institutional cluster. The first one, the political one, refers to a process by which those in authority are selected and are monitored also and are replaced. Each one of these clusters, then, at the time, we aimed at having a set of indicators. For each one, 2 indicators, and that's why it's going to be 2 times 3, and we have a set of 6 governance indicators. So in the political cluster, one of them is the extent to which a country enjoys or lacks voice and democratic accountability, basically the ability of civil society to freely express itself, organize, freedom of the press, gender equality, and so on. That's under voice and accountability, an absolutely key dimension of governance. But the other, which is very different, and that's why it's important not to just measure it with one each, is whether the country enjoys political stability and absence of major violence and terror. Because you could have voice and democratic accountability, but be plagued by violence and by total political violence. Those are different notions. So that's the second indicator. And then we move into the important sorry, yes, important economic cluster, which is essentially about two, again, crucially important functions of government. One is basically the public sector ability to deliver and deliver public services, and the other is formulate and implement policies, particularly regarding the regulatory quality. So that's why, again, two indicators come out of the more economic and bureaucracy part of government, the technocratic aspect of governance, which we measure through government effectiveness of the public sector in delivering policies, good policies, and public services, and the quality of the regulatory firm. Again, they are very different aspects, and there are governments that don't do very well on the first, and they do much better on the second, or vice versa. Although all these are correlated, of course, as we want to see as well. And last,
could you maybe speak a little bit more into the? It's a little bit still difficult. Your voice comes a little bit muffled. I just want to make sure that everyone understands it clearly.
Is it better now? Can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I'm bringing the microphone closer. Okay. So then we move. So we already covered. I hope, even if it was not optimal, was heard the political and the economic clusters of governance. And now we move to the last one, certainly not least, which is the institutional respect cluster of governance, which is the respect of citizens and state for the institutions that govern interactions among them. And again, two related but distinct notions that we attempted to measure at the time, and then we went into the governance indicator. One is the extent of the application of the rule of law in the country, not what's purely in the books, not we call the de jure, but instead the de facto. And the other is control of corruption. Again, they're related but distinct. Now, one of the reasons of spending the time providing this framework, even if one is interested in a very focused fashion on controlling corruption, is because corruption, at the end of the day, a significant aspect is a symptom of fundamental institutional failures and weaknesses. And one has to then go in and see what are these weaknesses. And these weaknesses we find with the evidence, they're very much in the other governance factors, some of which are more fundamental than corruption itself in terms of not being the proximate factor, of course, but more fundamental, like, for instance, voice and democratic accountability. Regulatory quality issues are very important, and so on. And of course, needless to say, rule of law is very important. And the other important factor in why I'm presenting this whole framework, is to suggest the importance of unpacking governance, because governance can mean so many things. I go to give talks to bar associations, and the tendencies to equate corruption with rule of law, and so on. If one goes to the regulatory events and so on, that's where the focus is. Instead, it's a broader and more complex focus that is very important to unpack. And by providing this framework, in addition to then going to measurement, one unpacks it what we consider a more useful approach. So then, what did we do in order to put together, long time ago, these indicators? Basically, we put with data on this 6 dimension of governance, which we gathered for over 200 countries. It's from 1996 and until the present. We it provides a synthesis of hundreds of underlying indicators. We use only sources that have nothing to do with us. We don't generate or make it, any data for this, and we don't make any judgment. Instead, these are 30 different data sources. We're going to go quickly through them very soon. All these, all the aggregate indicators and the individual data sources are transparently available in the website. And it's a very large database, and it basically came out of a research project. Actually, there's a very interesting but longer anecdote, not for now, as to how it went from being a research project as becoming an indicator widely used. Now, in terms of the individual sources, basically, we rely on very different types of sources. It's a pool of poles, and by triangulating the views and the judgments from very, very different type of stakeholders, we try to manage the issue of measurement error and so on, because at the end of the day, this does rely on judgment. So cross-country surveys of firms, so that's one source, and we see here in this slide the different sources for those of you who want to look very specifically what type. Cross-country surveys of individuals, so like of firms, obviously the Global Competitiveness Survey of the World Economic Forum is there, and the cross-country surveys of individuals, not only the Gallups, but also the regional barometers, Latino barometers, Afro barometer. So then there are the expert assessments from commercial risk rating agencies, which are experts in the country that provide their assessment, including, for instance, the Economics Intelligence Unit and many others, where we had sufficient coverage, and we vetted also the methodology for rigor and so on. And then we have the expert assessment from NGOs and think tanks, including on the Media Reporter Without Border, Freedom House, on the other side, Heritage Foundation, International Budget Project, and so on. And then finally, again, last but not least, is expert assessment from governments and multilaterals like the EBRD, African Development Bank, ADB, State Department also provides some, OECD, IFAD, and so on. And the individuals basically that provide the raw data, original data, are all over the world. They are in the countries themselves, and some of the basically of the institutions that do the measurement are headquarters in some of those countries. For instance, I happen to know, being a Chilean, and I know her very well, the leader of the Latino Barometer with in Santiago, who does it for Latin America. I know also in Ghana for Afro Barometer, and so we collaborate with them. So this is also very important that it covers, in fact, the whole world and all the regions in terms of who and the countries, who is providing this feedback. It's not somebody sitting in one capital or 5 capitals in the north, just providing their own assessment from a desk. So then, how do we build these indicators? We basically, since we found enough data, and then we had to put order on this data, which is not simple because it comes from very disparate, obviously, sources. The metrics, the scoring, the methodology is very different. So there were a number of choices we had to make. And at the end, we settled in one particular statistical model and developed in Stanford, some academic, which is an observed component model of the UCM to construct these composite governance indicators and to make order of that. And one of the advantages of that unobserved component model, and let me be very clear, one of the disadvantages is that it's not very simple. So it did require some modeling, and it's not totally straightforward, but it has the advantage that the results it gives is not only about the score in each case by aggregating, but also it gives an estimate of the margins of error for each country score, which for us was very important. It was extremely important to make sure that we were very transparent and precise about the degree of imprecision on this data, which in fact is the case for any data on governance, corruption, and related, and if I may say so, in the social sciences and even in economics. But for reasons that we can discuss later, in general, there has been an aversion of trying to acknowledge, let alone measure the extent of these margins of errors, particularly in official data. And again, there are quite a few anecdotes about that. The estimate of governance using this model is to use basically the weighted average of the observed scores for each country, and we restart to common unit. And the weighted average is an important concept that basically, since there are so many different sources, the unobserved component model itself, a bit like factor analysis, analysis, gives basically more weight, can give more weight to those sources that have higher coverage and that are more reliable and stable, so that we let the data speak and they get a bit more weight than the others. And that's totally determined by the data itself. We don't make any of those decisions. In fact, as it says here, the weights are proportional to the precision of the underlying data sources. And that precision depends on how strongly individual sources are correlated with each other, so that the judgment conforms also what others are also saying. And the margins of error that come out from these reflect the number of sources in which the country appears, because, and we have to keep in mind, some very small countries, the little islands in the Pacific, have very few sources. So obviously that's subject to the larger margin of error because it doesn't rely on many sources, but also it reflects the precision of those sources. So some sources have sense of precision than others. Then, I mean, if anybody is interested, it's all in the web, but I also have slides which I will spare now for the sake of time as to the math and the statistics involved in coming out exactly with what I mentioned in words. But trust me for now, and because let's get into the data itself. So here, there's one representation for one of the 6 indicators, which is control of corruption. And that's for the last period that we measured, is 2022, the 2023, which obviously one can work on that only in 24 because it come out during 24. It's going to be out in September, October. So this is the latest one. We see here about 75 countries, and that's because of space, so we don't have all the 200 countries. But let me mention a couple of noteworthy things, because you may be wondering, what is this color coding doing, and what are these thin lines atop each column? So here's the issue. The issue was, well, what kind of margins of error were we going to get out of this exercise? And could we make inferences? So the bad news, or the sober news, is that the margin of error has to be taken seriously and is not totally trivial. And that's what's reflected in that very thin line atop each column, as we say in the slide. So it makes no sense to try and run the horse races between two countries that are next to each other. I mean, like the Denmark, Finland, New Zealand, Norway, all those are top. Basically, they are within that range or the margin of error. In other words, statistically speaking, it's a statistical tie. And there's no point of trying to say I beat you by a nose in the horse races. And that's why also we never, ever, we always discourage anybody else trying to rate the scores of countries come out of these indicators according to score. Instead, we present always the data alphabetically because we have to be mindful of that, and very, very small differences are not meaningful. They are statistical ties. That's the sobering news. The good news is that the margins of error are not fatally large, that one cannot make inferences or comparisons. And we see it here. Basically, it does make sense still, and one can make inferences and analysis according to significant groupings or countries that are significantly different in a statistical sense. Obviously, the countries in green are statistically different, materially different than those that are in the middle in yellow and orange. And those in turn are very different, those in red, and particularly those in very dark red, which are in government crisis, obviously. And that's not within the marginal error, but far from it. Those are essentially many standard deviations away from each other. So instead of looking at that bar chart, one could say, well, how does a world map of governance would look like? And if these that you're seeing right now strikes you as, oh, that looks like a copy and paste from the web, that's exactly what it is. So one can go to the web and ask basically interactively through an interactive page with the data to create a map, and one can also zoom and so on. This happens to be for another indicator, voice and democratic accountability. The very light color, when it's very, very light, blue, as light as possible, it means extremely challenged. And very, very dark blue, it means close to model in terms of voice and accountability. And that's why it's not surprised that the Nordics and Canada are there, while the United States is not as dark as one would expect, given the mightiness of the country, but that may not surprise many of you. An interesting point to note, which I'm sure you know very well, but I'm stressing it anyway, that somewhere between Russia, other countries, post-Soviet countries, and the Middle East, overall, Middle East and North Africa, are more challenged on voice and democratic accountability than sub-Saharan Africa. You see there. Latin America scores a little bit better, but again, there is a variation, as we will see very, very soon. Okay, yeah, this is by zooming, and since I'm from Latin America and I know a bit about that, much more than about Iran, I wanted to showcase in Latin America the very significant differences. In this case, of course, it's about control of corruption. It's about another indicator. We see basically the whole spectrum between high level of voice and accountability in the likes of Chile, of Uruguay and Costa Rica, and then the other total extreme in the likes of Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. So that goes to say that when one starts looking very carefully at the data, one has to be very cautious when making generalizations about continents, obviously. But one has to focus similarly. Here we see the case of Africa and the Middle East at top, and this is for control of corruption. Now it becomes more mixed, even within the Middle East. It's not all very light, and one sees the whole spectrum there between Syria and other countries. And similarly in Africa, Botswana is an example of a country that does as well as some of the better performing countries in the industrialized world. So, then moving on to another way. So moving on to another way of showcasing the data, which also is generated through the interactive website, is asking the question, okay, now I'm interested in a particular country. How do I track it over time? And one of the advantages, frankly, of the governance indicators, as opposed to many others around, that we have been consistent since the late 90s until today in terms of the methodology, in terms also of the sources and how we treat the data and so on. So one can make comparisons over time, essentially since 96. Here, for the purpose of today, I'm showing the last 2 decades, decades plus from 2000. This is the case of a country that basically has totally imploded in governance. And I think it's very important to see not only control of corruption, but the other very fundamental factors, the complete implosion. Let me note that always the first column at top, each indicator with an accountability, for instance, would be the earliest year. This case is 2000, and then it's 2012, 2017, and 2022, giving a bit more visibility to recent times. Now, what about the mirror image of Venezuela? Well, interesting enough, I lost it, sorry. Here, the mirror image is the neighboring country, Spain, then colonial power in Spain, colonial historical antecedents, language, culture, and so on, has gone in a very different direction. And there are other examples like that I can put. I don't want to show Chile and Argentina or the two Koreas and so on, but you can, I'm sure, visualize in your mind that challenges the notion that it's all related to colonial history or to original culture and so on. Essentially, leadership, governance, people can make the difference through history and change things as we see in either direction, and very significantly. And this is Uruguay is an example of a country doing extremely well around the world. And in the Americas, in fact, nowadays, better governance qualities and unsung success than in many dimensions in the United States, which we see here. United States is it's far from being full. It's high, but and also the direction of travel is in the wrong direction. I'm sure you would have many comments and may not be surprising to many, but it's worth seeing it in the data itself. This is what comes out. Now, in terms of more modern countries, Denmark is it's a great case, and that shows a much fuller here. Now, I'm sure you were wondering about Iran. Many of you may have worked with this data, so you may know it. And well, it's clear that there has been a major challenge, and the trend line, as we see in this slide, has not been in the right direction, to put it mildly. Interestingly enough, and I think, Nadereh, you might comment about that because you wrote an article for the Atlantic Council. There was a brief period after 2010 to 2015 or so of a little recovery after a significant decline from 2000 to 2010 in many of these dimensions. But then there was a major reversal again. So it goes to show also that there may be significant declines over time, but they're not necessarily linear. And there are reversals and then reversals of the reversal. But I will leave, I mean, you would know much better how to open the black box of what this data is showing. It's interesting to to see as one comparator, you might be interested in the region, is Saudi Arabia, where if anything on voice and democratic accountability, it's in that basically a enormously challenged range, to put it diplomatically, as we see in the first indicator atop the slide. It has had issues also of violence, terrorism, and political stability. Yet on the more economic issues and institutional issues, they have managed to somehow make some progress on some dimensions. There's still, at best, the glass is half empty, and in other dimensions, it's practically full. But it shows basically a different picture than in the case of Iran. If one looks at it across regions quickly, there are a few interesting things to quickly note. There I'm just showing, and I'm prepared to, of course, share all these with you later, because I don't want to take all the time explaining and going through every data point. But I want to focus on a couple of noteworthy things. First, these indicators, and that's one of the reasons it's so important to unpack governance and unbundle it, they don't all move together, and they're not all equally correlated on equal levels across countries and even across regions. Middle East is noteworthy of how low voice and democratic accountability is, as well as the issue of political stability and absence of violence, which we have seen it brutally these days anyway. We know it well. While on issues of government effectiveness, at least on average, we saw Saudi Arabia recently, they don't do as poorly, and in fact, they do better than Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and even a little bit better than the former Soviet bloc in regulatory quality as well. Former Soviet bloc also, they don't do well at all on voice and accountability. Well, Latin America is the reverse picture. That's one of the strengths in my region, and also less violence and so on, while challenged on some of the other areas. Central and Eastern Europe is very interesting, because if I showed over time, which I don't have the time now, we would see, unfortunately for our region, Latin America, how Central and Eastern Europe over 25, 20, 30 years, overtook Latin America on many of these governance dimensions. So they have done very well. And Sub-Saharan Africa, contrary to some popular perceptions, is not the worst on everything. Not at all. And in fact, we can see, especially on voice and accountability, the South Asia, former Soviet or Middle East doing worse on that. So again, it's very important to be specific about what dimension of governance we're referring to, and which one we want to focus on at the country or regional level. And of course, we keep in mind what we said earlier, that we have to be very careful about just looking at the averages per region, because they hide a lot of variance, a lot of variation across countries, as we saw before. Quickly now, does governance and corruption matter? So you may say, okay, this is interesting. This is kind of interesting. You're showing out that it can be measured, maybe, but does it matter? And if so, how much? And in very brief and in simple terms, that we did that homework also over 2 decades ago. In academic journals, we went through all these and referees, and this is what we found. And using not only our methodology and so on, but different methodologies, and using this data set we have created, and we found, in essence, what we call basically the tripling development dividend from improving governance and corruption, which in statistical and economic terms is the following. Essentially, a country that makes the necessary changes, reforms, institutional changes, and so on, So to improve on governance, say rule of law, control of corruption, by 1 standard deviation, can expect in the long term, that's what we found on average, a tripling in income per capita. So from $10,000 per year per capita to 30,000. Of course, it's a long term, takes a long time for this fruit, but it's an enormous a payoff we found. And just to put in perspective, as most of you would know, 1 standard deviation in a normal distribution is essentially 1/5 of the distance between the worst and the best, because it's the normal distribution would have 5 standard deviations. In other words, it is realistic. It's not going from Equatorial Guinea to Denmark. It's essentially one standard deviation is going from Peru to Chile, and that kind of difference. We found a similar, basically, payoff from an improvement in governance for reduction of infant mortality and for increases in literacy. And other scholars have found also a very significant improvement regarding foreign direct investment, domestic investment, and also in terms of many others have worked on the issues of security, violence, and so on. Very importantly, and particularly if we are in the economics realm, we found a very close link between the control of corruption and global competitiveness. Essentially, countries that have significant challenges on corruption and governance suffer enormously, and is associated with significant declines in competitiveness. Similarly, there is a big, basically, premium in the market that a country has to pay because of governance or misgovernance, what we can call the governance tax, basically, of institutional failures and of corruption, which one way of putting it is a 1,000 basis points dividend of good governance. Why 1,000 basis points? Essentially, the spread difference that a country has to pay to borrow between a Chile, which has to, at least this was a few years ago, had to borrow at 200 points above LIBOR. Egypt, which is at 1,200 points above LIBOR, is 1,000 basis points. So this is economic statistical sense of the cost that corruption can involve. Then we do that with our data. We also did the analysis regarding budget deficits, and this is within industrialized countries. In fact, I was asked to do this analysis at the time of the Greek financial crisis. We're talking about over a decade ago. Major financial crisis, and there was a very, very strong link. Those countries, among the OECD countries, within the OECD countries, that essentially, basically, managed to control corruption, manage also their macro much better. It's not a coincidence that not many years later, then, by this strength of evidence, and I'm not talking about what I did, but more generally on what happened in Brazil and other countries, the IMF determined eventually, 6-7 years ago, that corruption is macro critical. The term was given. In fact, corruption and state capture as well. In terms of determinants of corruption, again, not giving full justice to this whole broad topic, but obviously the whole issue of voice and democratic accountability is strongly related, and that also includes transparency, freedom of the press, basically the rights of women, and so on. And there have been a number of studies that have shown some causal links on that, but of course there's always variation and counter examples, which may be exceptions that prove the rule. In that context, in fact, where there's more press freedom and where there's more transparency, and also women's rights, which are not showing in this graph, but we have done it in the past with data, then the extent of control of corruption is much, much better. So obviously, those are very important factors to work on. As I have promised, and that's the last part of my presentation, is that is a special focus on state capture. Because for so long, the approach to corruption was focused on traditional notions of more administrative and bureaucratic corruption, which in fact, in turn, emphasized what was happening in the implementation of the rules of the game. How do you obtain a license, a permit, a contract, and would you bribe, and so on. And we contrasted these with the phenomena that we observed in Joel Hellman in Russia and myself in Ukraine, the early days as the Soviet Union was dissolved and the new independent states came out. Instead, we focused on the shaping of the rules of the game, not on the implementation. The shaping of the laws, the regulations, the policy, and the key institutions by those that are extremely powerful, influential, either in the economy or in the politics, and very often the collusion between both. And we focus at first because the case was in Russia and Ukraine at the time on the oligarchs. So it was the undue influence of particular oligarchs. But over time, the concept has evolved, and basically politicians, and we see it nowadays in the case of a Russia's leader, can become the captor. So instead of focus on a public servant, which in the old days was who everybody would point the finger as being the corrupt public sector, focus shifted to often a powerful private who was influencing or colluding with a high-level politician. Captors are instead the shapers of the laws and regulations and not the takers, or the passive takers of our laws and the regulations, as we said. And we also did the homework. Where does it come from? A fundamental driver is the enormous inequality of influence that can exist in a country that allows that state capture by those influential captors to take place. Very important distinction from the traditional notion of corruption, that it can be totally legal. That's what we wrote a paper also on legal corruption and so on. But depending on how one changes the norms and the laws, which may be influenced by those captors, that has happened with the Supreme Court in the United States, where the definition of corruption has been narrowed. Basically, actions that will be totally unethical and illegal in other countries are not necessarily legal in some other countries, depending, in fact, of how effective the captors have been in capturing the legal regime. So it can be perfectly legal what happens. And in that sense, we find it, even the prevalence in the industrialized country of these, that is very important to focus beyond these traditional notions of corruption. So that to the question of Nadereh leads to the question whether it's worth, at least for debate, asking whether corruption needs to be redefined, or we talk separately between traditional corruption and state capture. The traditional definition of corruption is the abuse of public office for private gain. But again, that suggests very much a focus on the public official and the focus usually on bribery and something illegal. While state capture, given what I just mentioned, would suggest something quite different. It's more the privatization of rulemaking for the benefit, enrichment, and empowerment of the few, or the privatization of policymaking. It could be that, but it's in essence something rather different. In 2000, with Joel Hellman, we did a survey together with the European Bank. He was there, and I was at the World Bank, and we did a survey of all the economies in transition. And interestingly enough, we found countries that were doing relatively well in traversing to market economy and avoiding state capture at the time. This is 2000. So it's interesting, Estonia remained uncaptured, and we show very low in that context. Well, and Hungary too. Hungary is different now. Well, Russia, Azerbaijan, and so on were already captured from this stuff. Now, back to the future, and that's the very last few slides. This is what I've been working on recently, and it comes with all the cautions and the caveats. It's research, subject to margin of error, and so on. But I've been gathering different individual variables from different data sources, nothing that I have created, to create an indicator for state capture, similar but simpler, and not and with probably larger margins of error than the WGI that I presented before. But I wanted to show some early results because I think it's food for thought and for discussion. Again, we see 75 countries, the same 75 countries that I showed earlier on corruption. Here is with this initial state capture index. And I show it for the last period, 2020 to 22, because I average for 3 years for more robustness. And the first instinct is to say, well, it looks so much similar to what you just showed, so why bother? Well, the problem is, and the challenge is this. The challenge is that why bother is that the ordering of those countries I just showed in the full bar is very different than it was on control of corruption. And I'm illustrating this here. So in countries like Norway and the Netherlands and so on, it's very similar, very low corruption. You see on the far left, very low corruption, very low state capture. Once one gets to the United Kingdom, to the United States, to my own country, Chile has always been considered relatively uncorrupt, but there's a high degree of state capture by oligarchs, in fact. And that's one of the reasons the government that was elected a couple of years ago was elected, an uprising of sorts. So we see in the light blue, basically is the state capture much larger. United States, it's very significant difference. These are in relative but similar scales. Contrary to Greece, in Greece, it's more regular, traditional type of corruption than the typical capture by oligarchs, Slovakia, and so on. So they are basically difference that are noteworthy. Now, a very important, to my mind, finding of these, which makes it also important to measure these issues of state capture, is that once we look at state capture, and we just do not just focus on the illegal bribery and stuff, the high-income economies basically have higher, as we saw in the United States, it's a more extreme case, and there are a few others, but on average, high-income countries, they benefit from the traditional measures of corruption, which are the coarser type of things like that. But if one goes into this undue, basically elite capture and influence, then a different picture emerges. While the low and medium income countries, then there's a bit more exaggerated in terms of the traditional corruption. So we're talking definitely about different terms. Now, if one wanted to see, well, how similar they are, the both concepts I just showed with for some advanced economies that they're not that similar, but obviously I selected them, they were not random. Here is the whole sample of the 175 countries for which I have enough data. All the important countries are there. So one can see basically in this plotgram that, yes, there are quite a few countries. This is state capture index in the vertical y-axis and extent of corruption in the x-axis and the 45-degree line. And we see that there are quite a few around the 45-degree line for which it's not very different, but then there are major deviations for some others, including, by the way, Saudi Arabia, which is much more captured than is corrupt. Interesting enough, in the case of Iran, and that's where the arrow is, by the way, because so many countries are on top of each other, but in Iran, both are high, and both in relative terms come out similarly. So in the case of Iran, it's not that it makes a huge difference whether one is measuring corruption or measuring state capture, but because both are rather high, but others are so. And to finish, what are the trends over time? Again, they suggest that nothing is totally linear. Okay, Chile, my country, relatively speaking, although this is within the Americas, it's not very low. The corruption is much lower in Chile and so on, and it has remained basically at that level for good. But it started much higher than the United States, and then the United States basically, as we see in the red line, picked up. Then there was some improvement, so one can trace it, in fact, to which government was in power and so on, and we see the enormous increase during the Trump era, and some some retrieval recently, and we'll see how it shows. But interesting enough, again, as I hinted, Uruguay, another country in the Americas, does much better than both the Chile and the United States. And of course, the model country is in very light yellow at the bottom, is Norway, just for benchmark and showing the art of the possible. And then to end, completely different part of the world, much higher levels of state capture. We see, again, Ukraine and Russia. When Joel Hellman and myself were starting this work, and I was living, in fact, in Ukraine, very, very similar. Of course, both the products of the Soviet Union, and we see them so aligned. And this is already well into the transition, mid-90s. But then they take different paths over time. It takes a while, and Russia has gone in a completely different direction than Ukraine, while Ukraine one sees some kind of reversals. There are other interesting reversals that I'm not showing right now. Hungary and Turkey, unfortunately, show also how much this can increase. And I'm showing this because also the over time dimension, because I know the enormous challenge nowadays in asking oneself, what can we do in dictatorial regimes or autocracy? And the choices, we all know, are limited. So it's so important then, and we as economists are working with data to use these data as early flags for prevention. And there's a set of 50, 70 countries in the data set where it would be very important to show now and to work now and say, look, it's not fully state capture, but it's moving in the wrong direction. And it's yet at a stage that one could use it for prevention. Next week, I have to present at the UN to some diplomats who are interested, particularly on the issue of how these things can be prevented and not then after the fact doing things. So again, it shows that it can be very powerful to use these for prevention. Let me conclude. Now, sorry, I took longer than planned. Governance can be measured. Obviously, I'm biased, and it does matter, and it is so enormously. And within governance, corruption control is critical, and that's for inclusive socioeconomic development, for financial stability, for security, democracy, justice, anti-corruption, peace. So it's all through the social, economic, and political dimensions, not an economic issue, obviously. The notion of that can fight corruption by fighting corruption. Russia is in about 18 anti-corruption campaign. There are many other countries that go campaigns, or they create another anti-corruption commission or ethics commission and so on, or they adopt another law. All the countries in the world doesn't necessarily mean that they're effectively implemented. Instead, one has to look at the more systemic factors behind it. So the voice plus issues that we discuss are crucial. Transparency. Now there is a whole set of issues around public finance and public sector reform that I'm sure you are acquainted with as economists. That is a whole other session that we could have on that. And of course, political finance, and particularly in democracies where a strong or fledgling or incipient is absolutely critical as well. Addressing impunity and related strengthening rule of law, that's a whole chapter basically in itself that needs focus. And the reason, I mean, one is going through different dimensions as a list, but the fact is in different countries will require its own diagnosis by the experts like you in your own country. The focus will be on a couple of them, not on all of them, because that's where one starts and that's where the challenge is most. So prevention, I mentioned the importance of averting a descent to complete state capture, where early action may be important. Once the country is fully captured, it's so much tougher, and the time horizon is much longer, and that leads to the dire challenge in autocracies, which we did touch upon very simply and briefly. And last but not least, to reiterate and to go full circle, is the absolute paramount importance of the power of data analysis in this context that can make also a very, very practical difference, particularly in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danny. It was really a very rich presentation, and I think one needs to have definitely several decades to go into every single detail that you presented. I hope that we can have access to your PowerPoint, as well as, if you would be so kind, to also provide us the link to some of the papers and publications that you have done on this topic, because one of our objectives is to actually very much inspire new research and inspire new areas of analysis. And I think what you have done would be very incredibly rich for our researchers. Sorry, I should be putting my... Yeah. Okay. We have, I think, a few questions already in the pipeline. But before I give the sort of like the floor to the questions, I was just very interested in your slide. I think it was slide 38, where you had the different countries that were on this line that were better on in terms of corruption, battling corruption, as well as less. And I could not help but realize that many of the countries which have greater gender equality are doing much better versus the countries that are really ranking low on gender equality. So if you have a few maybe words on this topic, and then I would like to pass on to Kamyor or Mohammed to give to ask the other questions. But please go ahead. On the gender.
Do I need to go ahead? Yeah, I mean, this is nice historically, because one of the first contacts that, within the World Bank, it's no secret that this created nervousness. Before the mid-90s, we couldn't write the word corruption in any official documents. It was C ... And then it took Jim Wolfenson to come in and so on. And there's a whole story, a whole anecdote of how he allowed me and allowed us to do this and to put it on the web and so on. But there was a lot of nervousness, and particularly, as you can imagine, by the countries that didn't rate well. And one way are we getting involved on issues that were not strictly economic? So that's why it was very important to do the research on the links between corruption and other economic matters. And one of the first calls that I got with a lot of excitement, actually, very positive, was from leaders and researchers working on the gender group at the bank, which at the time that whole work was starting. I said, can you help us and see whether more gender equality helps on that? So they helped me, and we found some, and we found already associations then. So, and then many other and more rigorous research has been done, and by others, showing basically the more female participation there is in parliaments, you would know that literature, right? Those countries do much better in terms of governance in general and control of corruption. Very interesting case studies there are as to the inclusion of women in police force, right? And how that cuts in both in terms of corruption and crime. So these have been looked in many different dimensions, and I think the jury is out. And I would put it more broadly nowadays, and it goes back to, I mean, many of you, I know that you are economists. Basically, when I was at NRG, I had the privilege of having as the head of the advisory council a Nobel Prize. That was Michael Spence, who had also been a teacher of mine in grad school. And Michael Spence showed basically, and that's why he got the Nobel Prize, he showed how discrimination basically leads to subpar economic outcomes. So not even getting involved, or not in corruption, not in government, but even from a purely economic standpoint, how it pays off for firms and for everybody to basically promote those that have been discriminated against, and they, at the end of the day, they do better. So in competitiveness and so on. So that goes back in a long time, and I think the jury is completely out in those. Now, I'm sure you would support me on that. Let's not be naive. There are corrupt or rotten apples in every group. It's not that everybody is an angel on one group of people or one gender and not on the other, and so on. But it's different. This is notion that it's particularly, I think, it's consistent with the state capture lens, that if you haven't been in the essentially elite or boys network, you're accustomed to behave differently. So it's not just because you are a woman, but just coming from basically the outside and not having been captured cognitive. Much of the Wall Street thing was cognitive state capture. These old boys, they believed that they were doing the right things because they were all the time all together. So just bringing the outsider. So that I would even extend that, in particular in the context of the US, the women issue, to also racial minorities and others.
Actually, this is a good segue to one of the questions that have been put in the that have been put forward by Mahmoud Mescoub. I will read it. It says, "Thank you for the presentation. Have you looked at the relationship between corruption and state capture on the one hand and inequality on the other?" I assume he means not only just political inequality, but also income inequality. Is that have you looked at this relationship or this interaction?
Oh yeah, the answer is yes, and obviously, and there have been studies. I don't know if anybody is former or current IMF, but in the era of Vito Tanzi, who did so many pioneering research related to corruption and public finance, someone his team and the IMF looked into that issue, and others have looked at that even more than me in terms of the very strong association between corruption inequality. It's not one-to-one, but it is strong. There's always the challenge of causality in all these. That's why in our study, we had to do a special statistical technique to show that the causality directions goes from improving governance and lowering corruption to higher incomes, for instance. And the challenge also exists for the issues of inequality, and particularly because there are two dimensions of inequality which are crucial. Please do. One is the economic, which we all talk about, but the other is political inequality. And the case that we made in one paper, and we tried to suggest it also empirically with Joel Hellman long time ago, is that political inequality, the extent of political inequality in a country, and the political power that some individuals and parties may have, that leads to higher level of what we call crony bias and then state capture. So we looked very much at that. Because at the end of the day, I know that it's hard to swallow for us as economists, but economic inequality is mostly an outcome. It's not a fundamental driver of the rest. And we need to ask, where does economic inequality come from, right? And that's why the Piketty's and many others have studied that. It's an outcome. It's like economic growth and so on. And part of the focus I think we need to do more is on the whole notion of undue influence. At the end of the day, these individuals want to acquire also power for influence. And through that, of course, comes a lot of economic power, comes corruption, comes capture, comes other things. But I think we have not given sufficient focus to the issue of influence, and within that political influence. And I think in a sense, we're seeing it very brutally nowadays around the world.
We have two raised hands and also a very interesting question in the question line. Let me ask the question first, and then go to Mohammed, and then to Masoud Karshanas to kind of give you what's coming next. So this question is by Manuchere Taken, and he says, has there been any improvements in recent decades for reducing corruption by improvements in international banking rules and transparency regulation?
Yes and no. So, look, at the end of the day, these international initiatives, I'm a big believer in the banking rules, transparency regulations, and I was in the board of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative for a very long time. So we looked so hard, and I was involved also in the assessment, progress or no progress. The evidence is always mixed. But why is it mixed? Part of the reason it's mixed is because compliance varies significantly, right? Across countries and within countries across time. But I would venture to say that those initiatives that do have a little bit of bite, where there are clear standards and rules, like in banking, like in the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and I'm not just gathering for conferencing and agreements in principle, but where real measures have to be adopted, have led to improvements in some countries, but not necessarily across the board. I mean, in the case of Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, there are good case studies, including cases like Colombia, for instance, and others. But then there was a country, and there have been a few countries that have had to exit Azerbaijan, and so on, for non-compliance. So in that sense, one has to look at the different. And of course, as economists, we always worry about what the counterfactual would have been without those rules. So, and particularly for those countries that improved, maybe they would not have improved without that. But it's not as if the progress has been significant for every country in the world.
Maybe it is an interesting, before I go to Mohammed, to also say that our webinar today is extremely timely, because on June 12th there is going to be a major event that will take place for the first steps to establish an international anti-corruption court, which is like the sort of like along the lines of the International Criminal Court. There was a declaration on March 27, 2024, that was signed by something like 450 different statesperson, legal experts, and so on. And the purpose of this court is going to be to hold, as it says, to hold kleptocrats and their conspirators accountable when they commit corrupt acts, and that nearly all countries have agreed that these are crimes, and that include bribery of public officials, embezzlement and misappropriation of public funds, and money laundering. So there is going to be some international, in line with what Dr. Takin asked, these international rules. There's going to be hopefully a new chapter in anti-corruption, corruption battle, to sort of see what can be done to reduce state capture as well as anti-corruption. Mohammed John, did you want to make an announcement or ask a question?
No, just a question. So Daniel, thank you very much. I have two questions regarding the governance indicators and specifically the corruption that you introduced, and it's widely used in empirical research, of course. And often we hear two specific critics to these corruption, which is perception-based indicators. And often it's raised this question, to what extent these perception-based indicators of corruption match to the reality, a real experience of corruption? And do we have strong evidence this basically support a kind of robust correlation between what the people think and country experts think about the level of corruption in country and real manifestation of corruption? This is one common critique that often we read regarding these type of indicators, right? And the second one, or the second source of concern or debate, is the degree of media coverage of corruption cases and the extent that that might also influence the views and opinions of these people who are responding to these surveys. And if we, for example, back again to the case of some of the Arab countries in the neighborhood of Iran, like Saudi Arabia, Emirat, Qatari, which their corruption perception indexes are really good and they have improved significantly. But at the other side, the type of political institution is quite low, as you presented in the voice accountability system, and media freedom is obviously is not very high. So that might result basically that type of lack of media freedom might be also a reason that why corruption perception indexes in some of these countries also are relatively okay. These two points, I wanted to know your views on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm the first, and I'm acknowledging both points are valid. And as I mentioned up front, and it's worth restating, all this data is based, I mean, perception is one thing, but let's call it, these are based on judgments, because let's keep in mind, these are very different type of stakeholders. So there are also expert analysts that go according to certain criteria and not related to what's in the media and so on, although they may be influenced and so on. But anyway, these are all judgments. And as such, we started from the premise that they're real There are real issues that we need to be mindful of, and in a statistical sense, and I know you are great economists and statisticians, the way I always presented that the true statistical value for state capture, for corruption, for governance is unobservable. Okay, because of the intrinsic nature of what we are dealing with. So the best we can do is with proxies. These statistical proxies. These statistical proxies, in turn, are proxies, and as a result, are subject to margins of error, some biases, and so on. And that's one of the fortes, in fact, doesn't solve it all, but one of the fortes of triangulating and basically gathering as much information as possible from very, very different different sources, which also we do tests whether they influence each other or not, and we haven't found very compelling evidence. So at the end, we do measure that extent of disagreement and that extent of margin of error. But at the very end, this will not be, should not be considered the true value of corruption or of state capture. And every analyst should be basically looking at also other sources, other views, and it's all open to change. Now, I like to also suggest that even if it's judgment, or in the case of many citizens that are giving their own perceptions, they act in terms of investment decisions, in terms of voting decisions, and so on those basic, on that basis. And I find it that it's not my right to say, oh no, these are your perceptions and your perceptions are wrong. That at the end of the day, they act on the basis of what they are viewing the reality, whether it's the actual reality or not. So in some sense, that is useful. And last but not least, that's why it's also very important to look at what happens on a country over a long period of time and within the country. After all, the analysts and the people and so on, that's more or less, I mean, they're more or less similar. Yes, it can be a big scandal, and what we find is that it can be a short-term impact. If there is a huge scandal for like Lava Jato in Brazil and so on. But that's why it's so important also to not look, and we never do comparison from 1 year to the next, is to look at 5, 10, 15, 20-year trends in that sense. Finally, you raise a very important issue, is whether all these measures, not only ours, because CPI and many others, are underestimating the extent of corruption in totally closed societies, where many of these corruption, maybe citizens don't know enough about it because it's all so masked. That's possible. At the same time, we do find, even with that into account, that autocracies are on balance much more corrupt than non-autocracies. So it does come out. And you would know much better the case of Iran and other cases in the Middle East, but I would ask back whether it is the case that even in these very close societies and where there's no freedom of the press, whether the citizens anyway may know whether there is significant corruption or not. Now, a last point there that we all need to account, you did not mention it, but it may have been implicit in your question, and I find it that we need to be very careful about that too when analyzing that, is that the respondents in some of these very close draconian societies may be afraid of giving a rating which is very, very low, particularly for citizen polls and so on. And that may bias, again, you mentioned one country, certain things upwards, and it is part of the bias and the margin of error, even though we only rely on all these respondents and data which which is anonymous, of course, but the fear factor is very important in many polls, as we know. And just the last point, since we are among economists, if you allow me, I totally welcome those questions, and that's why I'm spending quite a bit of time and more than probably I should on agreeing that these are legitimate issues and we need to be conscious of that and deal with that. And that's why I'm very cautious in interpretation and not over-interpreting the data. I wish the same care went into official data. When we first wrote the first draft of how we were framing the governance indicators and the aggregation and the techniques and the statistical set, I sent it to the chief government statistician of a country. This is 30 years ago, almost. And he responded, I will never forget, and unfortunately, he's gone. He's not with us anymore. A great statistician. And he said, this is very good, this is interesting. He liked very many things. But I said, but you're going to get into trouble. And I said, what? He said, you're going to get into trouble because Simon Kuznets, when he created the national accounts for the United States, and that was the first, basically, framework for national accounting, he dared to have a last sentence in his seminal paper saying, after he had calculated what was the GDP of the United States, he says, but of course, it could be plus minus 5%. Plus minus 5%. And he said, nobody dared on official statistics. This is a chief statistician after Kuznets of putting margins of error to those indicators. This is a long way of saying, yes, I totally agree with what you said, but for perhaps not the same reasons. But there are also many judgments in national accounts. I don't know if you saw the article in The Economist about the World Bank finding $7 trillion for the global GDP that were unaccounted before, depending on the methodology you use. So all of a sudden, there's a 4% higher GDP for the whole world. But we never talked about margins of error about this GDP. But they're constantly being revised, and then we say, no, this was wrong. What about poverty estimates for countries and so on? So I wish we did this type of questioning and this ascribing of margin of error and this care for all the data we deal with as economists and statisticians.
Thank you.
We are running out of time, but I would very much still like to see, Masujan, if you would like to pose your question or comment, if you have any, please.
Sorry, I really, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I didn't have a question, but somehow I was brought up to the panel. So I just want to pose a more general question. Fair enough, you have all these indicators of governance, corruption, etc., and look at the correlations between these and different measures of development. Then somebody may ask you, so what? First of all, and this so what has two aspects. One is, first of all, what is the causality? It could be that a country that is doing well has a well-organized society and a strong civil society and a strong economic sector with a strong capitalist class which controls the state, then is doing well. And also in terms of your governance indicators are doing better than a society which doesn't have these things. And the second aspect of this, so what are we going to do about it? If you want to understand how to change these governance indicators, we have to understand the society. What are the interest groups? How are they interfering? How are they creating these anomalies in terms of corruption, state capture, etc.? And what are the implications? And therefore, we have to start from the bottom up rather than just knowing the index of corruption or the index of governance in our country. So I'd like to, as a skeptic about using these indicators, I want to see how do you go about, you know, apart from ranking countries and perhaps shaming some countries, etc., how do we try to make sense in terms of going forward using these indicators? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe because of the timing, I can give full justice to the serious question. But first, let me reiterate that I think, and that many heads of states and high officials who came to talk about these and wanted to do things about that, they were focused not so much how the neighbor was doing and the exact ranking and so on, but on the trajectory over time. We want to see the right trajectory. So again, I stress that this issue of the horse races and by nose, and that's why we never do rankings. That's others do that, not with our data, with another data set on corruption. That's why we focus on all these dimensions of governance, and some more boring than others, and everything is alphabetical. So the focus on so many users have used it to focus within the country and ask how we're doing over time. And those that have many questions about these and what happened during those years and so on, they are encouraged. They should go to the underlying individual data sets that inform these. And you may find that some are more useful for your use than others, and not use necessarily our aggregate. So I'm not wedded to aggregating indicator, but that's very different than questioning, and that's a much more fundamental question that I thought you were asking at the beginning, the so what? So what, whether governance really matters in this significant way. And that's we believe that we did the causality direction and the serious work, and that's why we went to serious journals and refereed and so on, and others have done it, and in so many different dimensions. And of course, at the end of the day, it may depend on what our view of our social welfare function for a country is. If we believe that those factors that I mentioned in terms of economic growth, in terms of gender equality, in terms of democracy values, and peace and security are all important, I think the evidence is out that this matters enormously. Now, if some would prefer to use other indicators to go through that, is fine. Now, where this, and a very important point that you are making, where not only I totally agree with you, but we did something about it in the early days. Our indicators are aggregated, so one has to go to the disaggregated level for each country to begin exploring what can you do at the country level if you believe that governance is important and it's important to improve it. To do so at the time, in fact, we developed, it was at the World Bank, a completely different tool, which was a governance and anti-corruption diagnostics. And 25 different countries, the leaders asked us to help, working together with the experts in the country and with civil society to develop action programs. And for that, there's much more granular detail and evidence. The indicators is not going to tell you exactly what the measures or the action program would be. If that was part of the tenor of your question, I totally agree with you. And that's why these indicators are rather more broadly, and they have to be complemented by the in-country, in-depth type of diagnostic work where the experts get involved and so on. There's no escape for that. The indicators themselves is not going to give you an action program. You're muted.
Thank you, Nadereh, you're muted. Nadereh, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Danny, for this very rich session. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to, inform us about what your work, as well as about how to go about this corruption and state capture perspective. again, we would very much like to have linkages to your papers, as well as if we could have the PowerPoint, that would be very useful. I think I will leave it at such, but I think Mohammed has an announcement for our next month's session.
Yeah.
And we are going to be talking, we have a session on July 10th on a historic analysis of Iranian economy 1920 to 1970s by Mohammad Farzaneghan, as well as Mary Yoshinari, Serhan Afajan, and Ali Asghar Saidi. So it promises to be a very exciting topic, as well as a very interesting discussion. With that, I would like to say thank you again, and we see you next month, and with great appreciation to Danny Kaufmann. Thank you very much. Thank you.